Hi guys, this is Joe here from Rufioh. Welcome to another deck profile. Probably one of my less creative ones because, let's be honest, True Draco is pretty straightforward in terms of how it works. Now, essentially what I wanted to talk to you about is some of the choices that are kind of flexible within the deck, why I've gone with certain ratios that I've gone with, although I think, again, most of them are pretty straightforward, and just sort of discuss what options there are, particularly in this side deck. We don't run an extra deck, so that's one less thing to worry about. Now, essentially what's happened is I've been playing Dragon Link since the Rocket structure that came out, so it's been a few weeks. However, the release of the tins has certainly changed my opinion on how it should be played. Now, the deck was already a glass cannon as it was. When it went off, it was insane. It's probably one of the most fun decks I've ever played. Unfortunately, it does get completely cucked by the new release of the tins and people's side deck and choices to go along with it. Now, that's not necessarily to say the combo decks are dead. Certainly, there are plenty that can just put up a monster negate from the get-go, and they're pretty much free and clear to continue to combo off, such as the likes of Pendulum. However, that's not a deck that I'm comfortable using, at least not just yet. So, what I wanted to do was go back to a deck that I knew I could play comfortably, had a reasonably good meta matchup, and was basically a control deck of some variety. Now, I'm not confident enough with the likes of Sky Striker. I could probably play it in like a local level, but certainly when you get to regionals and you get guys who've been playing the deck since its release, I'm certainly not going to be winning those mirror matches, and they're the kind of matches you have to win in order to top a regional or any kind of event above local, certainly. So I went to True Draco, again, just because I know how the deck operates. It is a little bit of a cheese out because you can just flip floodgates and get your wins that way. There are some decks that are just not prepped for this at all, and you get your wins through that means. Now, my intention is to try and qualify for Euros early this year. I didn't go to nearly enough regionals last season to qualify for Euros. I ended up qualifying at Nationals, but it didn't give me a long enough time frame in order to be able to save the money and make plans from there out. However, next year the plan is to go to Euros and certainly to qualify a little bit earlier so I can start saving that money together and go on from there. Anyway, before we get stuck into deck profile, which we will do in just a moment, I want to apologise in advance if there are any crazy noises. This is actually my second take with recording this video because my dog is an absolute arsehole. I live in the noisiest house with the noisiest dog in the noisiest street, so hopefully we don't have any crazy background noises, but there you go. So let's get stuck in, shall we? So we'll start off with the obvious. We've got one Dinomight Knight. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. He is at one. If he was at more than one, I'd be running more than one, certainly. Definitely your best Draco, probably to go into most of the time. Usually going to be the one that you search out with your Majesty Maiden. So, of course, just one of him. Just a 2 Majesty Maiden because, again, you're only running essentially 4 targets for it. Obviously, it can get itself, but, you know, that's kind of whatever. So just 2 is absolutely fine. It's not one that I often feel like I want to go into because you search through all your spells and traps so quickly that you'll see monsters reasonably quickly afterwards anyway. But it does give you the option if you find yourself in a bit of a tight situation, which running a deck with so few monsters can occasionally come up. So we're running a couple of copies of this. This is pretty standard. Occasionally people will run just the 1. Some people will run 3. I think 2 is the perfect medium, so that you're not going to open it all the time, but you've got the option to go into it. We are running 3 Ignis because it's at 3. I believe this is absolutely correct. You run 6 options essentially to go into from the deck. So why wouldn't you run it? You know, you want to get those spells into your hand or onto the field as quickly as possible to set up your plays. It's also a big body, which is quite nice. So just something to consider there. I run 2 Inspector Border. Now, the debate is always there about whether a Mono or Inspector Border is correct. From pretty much, YCS London last year, I took Dracos, and I was adamant then, as I'm adamant now, Inspector Border is absolutely the correct pick. I think even more so for this format than it was back then. A lot of the time, you can get this with like any Floodgate or any kind of interrupt on board, and you've just won the game. It's absolutely insane. You could argue that you could run 3, but you really don't want to see multiples, and you really don't want to be drawing them off things like Card of Demise because they often end up just being a brick, and it means you end up ditching a card to grave that you wouldn't necessarily want to. So just something to consider. Now, on that subject of Card of Demise, I'm running triple copies here. I had a nightmare of a situation at locals the other day. I absolutely swifted one of my boys with his Salamangreats, and I was like, okay, I'm feeling good today. And then my very next game I play against a different opponent, I go Card of Demise, I've top decked it, and I draw 3 Draco monsters and I just can't play. It's absolutely fucking stupid. But the rest of the time, Card of Demise has been absolutely insane. It's very rare that this comes up and it's bad. Yeah, it's just an insane card. I mean, it says draw 3 essentially, which is something fantastic and something we should all be wanting to do. We're running triple copies of Heritage because drawing cards is fun, and of course it's got that effect that allows us to tribute, much like the other Draco spells and traps. Just being able to draw cards after you've popped is insane. Like, you can pop cards with Diagram. If you don't know how the deck functions, that's usually what you do. You're going to pop a spell or trap, or you're going to tribute a spell or trap, and then you're going to use this to draw multiple cards. And essentially it can allow you to draw up to 3 cards. Based on how the deck works and that kind of thing. Usually I'm drawing 1 or 2 at most, but even still, draw 1 is nice. And the fact that it's continuous is pretty cool as well. We've got our own Pot of Avarice in here. We've got Disciples. Again, I feel 3 is correct. I've seen some versions where people run just the 2, maybe to squeeze something else in. I think 3 is perfect. Being able to shuffle back cards that you've lost. Essentially, you can create a loop with this. If you get 1 or 2 of these going, if one's engraved, you can just recycle it and you'll constantly have access to Disciples, unless your opponent finds some weird way out. And it means that you're always going to have resources in your deck to go along with everything else. Running triple Diagram, I would say this is pretty much compulsory. I've never seen a list where anyone runs anything other than 3. This card is insane. The fact that it means that your big boss monsters, because that's what they all are, have to be killed twice before they can be destroyed in battle. They gain, attack and defense. They're gonna allows you to pop cards and do searching. It just lets you rig your hand. It lets you keep your boss monsters on board, and it helps you beat over stuff really, really easy. This card's insane. For a long time, people wanted to see this get hit in some capacity on the list. I don't think it needs to get hit now, and I really wouldn't want it to. I really like the card, and it also enables some other kind of decks, but usually this is what it's played in. You already know how crazy Diagram is. I'm sure I don't need to elaborate any further. We have 2 copies of Pot of Desires, just purely because I didn't have space for the 3rd. I would run the 3rd if I felt like I could cut anything from the list, realistically. But I really like the ratios so far, so I really don't want to cut it beyond that. But 2's great. I mean, you're going to search out most of your important pieces fairly quickly, and if you're in a position where you aren't able to do that, then you're probably lost anyway, so you might as well just banish the 10, draw the 2, and hope that you see a way to play. Now, fortunately, the whole deck is built in that mentality of I can draw essentially only 2-3 cards, whatever, and I'm going to be able to see a way to play normally, or at least stop my opponent playing long enough to get into the things I want to. This isn't the kind of deck where you're running like a lot of individual cards that are really important to combos, because that's just not how this operates. So Desires in this is just a really strong choice, and I think at 2 it's absolutely fine. We've got 1 copy of Terraforming purely because it's at 1. I had been tempted to try things like Metaverse. It just doesn't do enough for me. Essentially running 4 copies of Diagram is pretty cool anyway, and we've got plenty of other ways to dig deep and try and see it as quickly as possible. Of course, if it was at more than 1, we would be running more than 1. We have triple copies of Pot of Duality because, well, you're basically never really special summoning with this. Occasionally you can do off return. It's actually rare that I find that comes up. Usually I'm using return to just pop another card for the most part. Of course, it does give you the option so that you can protect your board a little bit or give you some other ways to play, but just something to consider. Move on to our trap lineup. So I've got triple copies of Apocalypse. Again, I'm not sure that this is negotiable. You should be running 3 copies of Apocalypse. Been able to half opponent's attacks, pop monsters, tribute during their turn. It's just a solid card, and it's searchable, which just makes it even more broken. We have 2 copies of There Can Be Only One. This is purely because I only have 2 copies. I would run the 3rd if it was available, most likely, although the question of what I would cut is a little bit more of a difficult one to answer. This is really, really good against the vast majority of matchups. However, there are some where they can play through it. Like if you're playing a deck that's placed with dangers, they just don't really care. Striker are running this themselves, so it doesn't all that much hurt them. They can play through it, but pretty much the other decks have a bit of trouble with it. We move on to the Monarch's Erupt. It's the reason we don't run an extra deck. This card is that powerful. Essentially, we're running triple copies of Skill Drain. However, this one basically goes, you're allowed to activate your effects, but your opponent isn't, which is pretty nice. A lot of the time, again, if you open this with like a good Draco on board, and any other kind of interrupt, which again this deck is built to do, you're normally good to go. Your opponent has to go through some real loopholes to get rid of this card, because most people rely on their monster effects to get rid of back row. We have 1 copy of Imperial Order. I think this is just really good to have in just in case. A lot of the time you can set up your board, get all your plays going, and if you open this in your first hand, you can actually just lock your opponent out of playing. If you come up against a striker matchup, it's, well, more or less a free win, although a lot of playing Typhoon and things like that to get around it, but I think Imperial Order is really strong, and worst case scenario, you just tribute it off for a Draco and you carry on your plays like normal. This is a new addition, something that I wasn't running last year. A lot of decks are starting to run this now because there is so much graveyard focus, particularly with the likes of Orcust and that kind of thing. We've got the same with Thunder Dragon, Salamangreat, all of those. Being able to activate effects in grave or banish is a really important part of a lot of the modern meta decks, and being able to counter that by paying 1,000 life points and your opponent is just shut down when it doesn't affect you in any way whatsoever is just insane. This card is really, really good, and your opponent normally again has to go through a lot of loopholes and go into really negative plays in order to get rid of this so that they can continue their plays as normal, and usually it puts them in an awkward enough spot that you can capitalize on that. And much of the 1,000 life point payments, we've got skill drain. A lot of people cutting this for the third erupt. I'd like to be in a position where I know that if I don't have access to my monsters, I can still shut my opponent out of playing their monster effects. So this does come up occasionally. It's usually in a bit more niche scenarios, but it's really, really nice when you see this and your opponent just can't play through it. It's absolutely insane. We have the one copy of Return. As discussed earlier, I'm not usually special summoning off this. Most of the time it's a tribute during my opponent's turn, popping cards, that kind of thing. However, it does give you that option for the special summon, which is really nice, particularly where things like Metaltron in the side deck come up. Just gives you an easier way to get into that. We have triple copies of Solemn Judgment. My first initial build of this since coming back, I only had the 2 copies, and every single time I flipped it, I just wished I always had one more. There's games where I open 2 and it just stops my opponent playing it and I go on to win the match the next turn. Solemn Judgment is just insane. I think it's honestly one of the most skillful cards in the game to know when to flip, because really it is one of those things where it can just insanely hurt you. I mean, half your life points. I know it's a resource and all of that, but opponents could put 4k on board really, really easy. So just knowing exactly when to flip this to end your opponent's turn is a lot of skill in and of itself. I love the card, and seeing 3 copies of it's just insane. I could never cut this any further. And that is it for the main deck. Again, there are some negotiable positions. There are certainly things I may change in the next couple of days, but I think that this is probably the list I'm going to go for the Milton Keynes Regional. By the time you see this, it'll probably be the Friday night, maybe even the Monday after the event. Who knows? We'll see. But we'll see what the timeline brings to us. So we're going to look at the side deck now, of course, because there is no extra deck. Some of the choices here, again, are very much negotiable. And there are some thoughts I have on some of these choices here. This is what I've essentially been running for locals, because, you kind of tweak to what you're playing against most. However, for a regional, I may change some of these choices. Now, we start off with the big rock itself. The reason that I'm actually playing this deck, along with, Dark Ruler No More also being a cuck, that being able to play combo decks, this really just punishes people. And by the virtue of it just existing, people will attempt to play around it. People are playing awkward combos. People are playing cards they wouldn't normally play to play around it. People are not summoning up to the 5 monsters, all of that kind of thing. So it's a question of whether you want to continue with this and hope that it's still useful, that your opponent banks on you not having it or just doesn't care, and that you hope that they can't play through it. Or you go into a situation where you run something like Sphere Mode, which is actually what I did at my previous locals, so this is kind of incorrect. But and I found that Sphere Mode was actually sufficient, because people would go to like 4 summons and kind of just stop, end on like a half a board, because they'd know that they could probably still play, and then the next turn they can just try and kill you. Or you get people who put up the Monster Negate pretty much straight away. You get people playing Ibli and that kind of thing to try and counter it. So just things to consider. People are trying to find ways to play around this, so it is something I may consider actually cutting in favour of Sphere Mode. That decision will be made over the next couple of days. We have the one copy of Metaltron. I think most people side this in Draco now. Just being able to switch off your opponent's spells and traps, or even monster effects, depending on what you're playing against. Gives you the edge in a lot of matchups. This against Altergeist, this against Sky Striker is really, really solid, because you can just negate whatever it is that they're playing with, most of, usually spells or traps, depending on which one of those 2 decks it is, and they usually can't beat over it, because they don't have anything big enough, and they can't usually get there. So it's a really, really good, important card. It's also really important in the mirror. It helps you just out your opponent's board. It's just a really good option to have access to, and for one side deck slot, it's definitely worth it. We have triple copies of Dark Ruler No More. One of the good things about True Draco is that even though it runs quite heavy trap lineup, again, you can cut a few of these if you know you're going second, but you can play going second, because these traps and these spells continue to allow you to break boards. And because you summon such big monsters straight away, you can normally lock your opponent out of playing, pop you know, the relevant cards, and then just crash over stuff, settle your back row, and go for the next turn, and they usually can't play. Dark Ruler No More just enhances this ability by shutting off your opponent's monster effects. If you need to crack a board where, let's say, the likes of Thunder Dragon, which this deck has a really bad matchup against, and you can switch off their entire board, their protection effects, that kind of thing, and you can crack their entire board, normally you're good to go. And I just feel that this is really important to have access to in the side deck. We have triple copies of Anti-Spell purely because, again, it can be tributed off so easily. It helps you in the striker matchup, which, you know, most of the time you've normally got an okay matchup with, but it gives you additional options. Of course, it also incredibly hurts pendulums, which this deck can struggle with, particularly if they go first and that kind of thing. But if you can break their board and then you can set this, you're normally good to go from there out. I played last year at YCS London. I played against the pendulum deck, and having the 3 copies of this was just insane. He managed to break the first 2, he couldn't get through the third, and I went on to win the game. We have 2 copies of Infinite Impermanence. There could be some debate as to whether to up this to 3 or not. I really like it because it's the one-hand trap where you can just set it. I know some people like to play things like Ghost Ogre, which is good for combos and that kind of thing, but I still think Infinite Impermanence is just incredibly strong. If you're going second, you can switch off an opponent's monster effect that would normally hurt you and just go on to break the board. We have double copies of Shadow Imprisoner Mirror, again just purely because I have the 2, but this is really good against the Orcus matchups and that kind of thing. I find that this deck is kind of lacking at times against that kind of build, particularly Orcus, and being able to switch off their effects is just really nice. It hurts them quite a lot. The unfortunate thing is I just never seem to draw it, which is, you know, it's one of those things, but when it comes up, it's absolutely insane. And then finally, I just have the 1 copy of Summon Limit, purely because I only had the 1 slot left. I wanted to put another Floodgate in that may hurt some other decks, and this was my option. Again, this side deck is very much open to interpretation. If you're looking to play this deck, definitely base it around what you're going to be playing against regularly, and for regionals, there's definitely some changes you'd want to make here. But that is it for the deck profile. Like I say, guys, it's nothing too spicy for you all. Again, it's a deck that people are just pretty much know what kind of ratios you're going to play, but it's just some food for thought for if maybe you're playing Draco out there and you want some choices. Here's what I've gone with, and maybe this can help you too. So hopefully we'll go to the regional and we'll get a good result, even if we can't necessarily top. Hopefully we can go in and just get some good results, hopefully get some good footage for you guys to show up on the channel, although I do have a gig pretty much 2 hours after it finishes, so it may not be the case that I can finish getting all those videos that I'd like to. Thank you very much for checking in, guys. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this video. If by chance you haven't had enough of listening to me waffle at you through a video about a children's card game, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. The links are on the screen, or if you're feeling really lazy, you can click the links in the description. While you're at it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future content too. It'll make me smile, I promise. And who can ask for more than that? Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.